Thank you very much. I'm really glad to be here to present this paper. It's called Building the City, Urban Transition and Institutional Frictions. And it's joint work with Vernon Henderson, my supervisor, and Anthony Venables. So what is this paper all about? Well, first, we develop an economic theory for the developing world. The model should incorporate these two things. The second is we add in data using very high resolution satellite imagery. We had this for Nairobi in 2003 and 2015, where we have manually digitized buildings. So this was actually very, very helpful for us, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where data quality is quite poor for high spatial resolution and having comparable data sets across time. And finally, we bring the model together with the data to get an estimate of the welfare cost of delaying the conversion of land from slum use to the formal sector. So why do we care about these questions? And what are we doing that's new? So in sub-Saharan Africa, cities are quite large already, and they're growing very quickly. So the UN estimates that there's about 500 million people living in cities in Africa today, and this should more than double by 2050. About 60% of these people today are living in what the UN calls informal settlements. So understanding how this rapid growth and informality plays out in the city's development is really important for a lot of people. The second thing that I didn't realize before looking into this is that the built volume of a city is actually of high economic relevance. The majority of a nation's capital stock is actually in buildings, and in sub-Saharan Africa, where manufacturing is quite low, we think this is probably even more important. So there's important issues here, but what are we doing that's new? So the first is on urban theory. So in economics, typically urban models are created for the developed world. So this means they're either static or they don't incorporate informality. On the empirical side in economics, we don't know of any study that's used high resolution satellite imagery like this to detail the way buildings are changing over time. And finally, we developed this methodology to calculate the cost of the delayed use of land in the informal sector. So let me talk to you a bit about our theory. So there's a lot of ingredients going on here. I said the model's dynamic. It's also monocentric. So that means that prices are increasing towards the city center, and prices are increasing across time. But one of our main contributions here is on the supply side. So we have differences in building technologies. So a land developer chooses an amount of volume to build on a piece of land at a specific point in time, and he can use one of two technologies. The first is this formal sector technology, which we call putty clay. So buildings can be sculpted, but once they're sculpted, they form clay. They're hard, they must be smashed to be replaced. And also there's an increasing cost to building tall in the formal sector. The second technology that the developer can choose to use is this slum-style technology, which we think of as flexible pieces that continuously can be readjusted and added. So in the model, what the developer does is he chooses an amount of cover, but cannot build tall with this kind of technology. This cover is continuously adjustable over time. That's this flexibility. And the more cover you add, the more there are disamenities to crowding in slum housing. So the final thing here that we add is this idea of formalization costs. So it's costly for the very first time that the developer wants to build using the formal sector use. And so pulling this together with the rest of the model, we can get simulations of what cities might look like under these assumptions. So each of these three graphs here are cities with built volume on the y-axis. And moving out towards you, to your right, we move away from the city center. And to your right, into the page, we move forward in time. And so this first graph on the left shows a city where we've assumed that all formalization costs are zero. And so starting in the corner closest to us, as we move forward in time, or towards the city center, prices are growing. And at a certain point, it becomes optimal for the developer to start building something. And that something happens to be the informal sector because it's not, or it's more land intensive than the formal sector. As we continue to see price increases, this cover will be continuously adjusted because of the flexible technology. But at some point, the price reaches a trigger where it becomes optimal to switch to the formal sector technology. Because the formal sector technology is inflexible, we have flat heights over a period of time until we reach a second trigger. The first formal sector development is knocked down, and a second taller formal sector development is built. And so what we get is a city that has a declining height gradient from the city center with the informal sector located at the fringe. The graph in the middle, what we've done now is assume that there's some sort of arbitrary fixed cost to formalizing land. And you can see what this does is it delays the amount of time that that chunk of land from 10 to 15 kilometers is in informal use. The last graph here on the end, what we've done is we've assumed that there's complete heterogeneity in the costs across the city, and we end up with what we call the city hodgepodge. And so here we have very tall formal sector development next to very crowded informal sector development that we see in the real world. Okay, so moving on to the data for Nairobi. So what we've done here is just show some descriptives about how the built volume in Nairobi is changing over this decade. So just some background on our data. We use these building footprints, and we've created an algorithm that determines whether or not these two cross sections of footprints, whether or not each individual building has remained unchanged over time, has been redeveloped, is infill, or has been demolished. We use one single definition of slums because because definitions are inconsistent across time. So all the talk about changes that we have are all in the intensive margin of this slum map. So first, on volume growth, we see very high levels of change. So across the whole city, we have about a 59% increase in the amount of built volume in the city. If we break this down by sector, it's about 60% in the formal sector and 55% in slums. And we can further break that down by distance. So this graph shows us growth in volume by distance to the city center. The blue line shows us that near the city center, the formal sector is growing more quickly, while further out, the slum sector is growing more quickly. So this ties back into our model with the idea that near the city center, the formal sector is playing an increasingly important role in terms of the built volume, while the slums continue to locate at the fringe. We also find a massive amount of churning. So about 35% of the buildings inside 3 kilometers in our data set were torn down. So this is about 3 to 4 times what we would see in a typical US city. We can break this growth down even more. So on the top here, we're going to break it down by the process of change. So this is whether or not buildings have been redeveloped, infilled, or demolished. And so the graph up here, the blue line shows us the growth of volume due to redevelopment. And so near the city center, redevelopment is adding more volume, while further away, it's coming more from infill. What's also interesting is breaking down the growth by sector. So on the bottom here, we have the heights of buildings along the distance to center. We have the formal sector in blue and slums in red. The solid lines are the heights of unchanged buildings, and the dashed lines are the heights of redeveloped buildings. So what we see in the blue lines in the formal sector, when buildings redevelop, they're redeveloped to higher heights. While in slums, the buildings are quite low to start with, and even once they're redeveloped, they remain low. So again, this ties back into our theory. And so it's encouraging to see that these patterns and the data really match our theory, and we can combine what we see in the built environment data with prices and household rents to calibrate parameters of our model and get estimates for the cost of this delayed use of slum land. So just to give a bit more intuition on these formalization costs that we're thinking about, we think that each piece of land in a city can have a different history of conflicting claims to ownership on that land. And whether or not these conflicting claims can be big issues or small issues can lead to either longer or shorter delays in the amount of time that this land is in slum use. And so we want to get an estimate of the cost of this delay. So as I said, we calibrate the parameters of the model using our data. We plug in the calibrated parameters to get estimates of the present value of land at different locations based on the date of formalization, which we call parameter Z. So we can do, here we do two sort of exercises. The first is we can say, let's consider two scenarios. One where we formalize today, so Z is 2015. And the other one is where we let the informal sector indefinitely persist. So Z goes off to infinity. And if we do this on the land from 3 to 4 kilometers using our calibrated data, we estimate that there are losses around 270 million on aggregate and about 9,200 per slum household on this land. And so typically these households are paying about $260 a year for their housing. So there seems to be a lot of room for improvement if we can manage to overcome some of these institutional costs. So the other exercise we can do is we can think of, if there were no formalization costs, what would be the optimal date of conversion? And so in this table, we can, in the yellow row here, you can see this at different distances from the city center, when would have been the optimal time to develop this land? And so we see inside of 6 kilometers, all of this slum land has already passed its due date. Okay, so just to wrap up, first, in the model, without formalization costs, we have slums locating at the city fringe. But adding these costs can create a more believable looking city with this city hodgepodge. In the data, we see large increases in growth, and this is being delivered differently in the informal and the formal sectors. And when we tie this together, we see, doing our welfare cost calculation, we see that there are large gains to be made potentially by reducing some of these frictions. And also that plenty of the land near the city center in Nairobi seems to be past its due date in terms of slum use. So moving forward, we're really interested to take this study to a wider set of cities, which is why kind of we focused on using satellite imagery to begin with, and why we're really encouraged with this kind of data. But for this project, we had to rely on both manual digitization of the buildings, and also we had to use LiDAR data to get the heights. So we're really interested to see kind of what's coming next from the geosensing work on automatic building classification and also height classification from two-dimensional imagery. That's all. Thank you.